Today we're going to talk about two-step equations, and I have examples here to talk about. It's not Algebra 2, it's two-step equations. We're going to do some algebra here. And I have problems here which I'm going to go ahead and do out. But first I want to talk about this. I want to make sure that we realize equivalencies. If I say 3 plus 4 equals 7, that's a true equation because 3 plus 4 are like terms and you can sum them to 7. Now, if I subtract 2 from each side, 5 still equals 5. So I can do a one-step operation. One thing I notice with students often is they do things like this. And 6 plus 4 is 10, 7 times 2 is 14. When we multiply, we have to multiply everything on both sides. And what that means is every term has to be multiplied for these problems to stay the same. And I see that as a number one error when I talk with students. So we're going to start with that in mind, and every time we do these problems, we're going to look at how many terms there are. Alright? So if I set the board here so I get everything, every time I look at a problem, I'm going to count terms. So on this one, I'm going to see there's one term, the negative 4, and on the right side of the equal sign this time, there are 2 terms. Now, that means there are 3 terms total. Every time there are 3 terms, I'm going to look to add or subtract first. And I always want to get the term with the variable by itself. So I want to get x over 4 by itself. Well, that means I have to get rid of the minus 2. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides. Again, that keeps the equation the same. And I get negative 2 equals, and these 2's, negative 2 plus 2 becomes 0. 0 plus x over 4 is still x over 4. So my first step when there are 3 terms is add or subtract. So here's the first step. Now I look and I say, what's happening to the variable? X is being divided by 4. So I need to multiply then the opposite operation, both sides by 4. And I get x equals negative 8. And that would be my solution. Now, when you have simple problems, you can take that value and make sure it works. And that's what I have shown here. I get negative 8 in place of the variable. And again, you notice that every time I substitute for a variable, I use parentheses. And again, you're just going to make the check. And the question is this problem the same? And you can see through the steps that negative 4 and negative 4 are equivalent, and I start from the original equation. Thus, negative 8 is the solution that makes number 1, the equation, true. I'm going to work through the rest of them quite a bit faster. I'll talk about the number of steps, but every time we look at these, we want to talk about how many terms there are. So on number 2, how many terms are there? 1, 2, 3. So we're going to look to add or subtract first. We're going to subtract 7 first on both sides. Get 2 equals n over 2. Again, the variable n is being divided. The opposite operation is multiplied. And I get n equals 4. First step, and then multiplying is the second step, two-step equation. And again, is 4 the answer? I plug it back into the original equation and using parentheses, and you notice I get 9 equals 9, which is a true statement, thus it is correct. I have 4 more here on the board. If you pause the video now, you can try these. I'm going to work them rather quickly. Okay, now again, this time there are parentheses. There are only 2 terms, the 14 and this. So the first thing you got to do is multiply. Well, I need to distribute this. 7. And when I do that, I get 14 equals 35 plus 7r. Now if I count the terms again, there are still 3 terms. So now we must subtract or add. Well, I subtract the 35 on both sides. I get negative 21 equals 7r. So here's my first step right here. I divide both sides by 7, and I get r is equivalent to negative 3. We look at the check, and we see whether or not I did it correctly. I replace the r in the original equation, and I get 14 equals 14. Now, This is one that gets students. They look at this and they get confused. Remember, this is one bit of junk. So when I look at the equation on number 4, I only see 2 terms. So I got to look to multiply or divide first. So I'm going to see that the stuff is divided by 3. I'm going to multiply both sides by 3. And I get 6 equals -8 plus b. So I started with 2 terms, and when I make the multiplication, I ended up with 1, 2, 3 terms. So now I'm going to look to add or subtract. Well, I want to add 8. 14 equals v. Again, I'll take a look at my check here, and you'll notice that when you substitute 14 in for v, 14 plus -8 makes 6. 6 divided by 3 is 2. So then you start mixing them up like 5 and 6. Again, when you look at problem 5, you have to see there are only 2 terms. You have a sum divided by one fraction line. It means it's one term. A sum divided by 21 equals -1. I need to multiply by 21 on both sides. -10 plus x equals -21. That was my first step in multiplication. Now I'm going to add 10 because there are 3 terms now. X is -11. When I bring down my check, you'll notice that when I plug -11 in, it works out. On the other side now, let's count terms. 1, 2, 3 terms. I have to get the term with the variable. I have to get this thing alone. So I need to get rid of -5. I'll do that by adding 5 to both sides. There's my first step. I look at what's happening to the variable. A is being divided by 5, so I do the opposite operation, which is multiplying by 5. And I get -15 equals A. And again, I take the time and substitute back in my original equation and find that when I plug that in, it is equivalent on both sides. Last 2. Now, most of us haven't been struggling with this one. 1, 2, 3 terms. We need to subtract the 1. 10n equals 10. 10 times n, the opposite of multiplication is division. N equals 1. Again, when I check it, it works. On the second one, I count 1 term, 2 terms. So I need to multiply or divide first. I see that the 5 plus x is one thing, because it's one fraction line here, over 10. So I need to multiply both sides by 10. And I get 5 plus x equals 0. How many terms here? 5x, 0. 3 terms. Got to add or subtract. I need to subtract 5. So x is equivalent to -5. Let's see if that works. Five plus -5 makes 0. 0 divided by 10. If you have 0 cookies for 10 people, how many cookies does everybody get? 0. 0 equals 0. That's true. And there we go. When we practice 2-step equations, we need to be checking back to the original equation with our solutions. Keep practicing and it will go well.